A black woman was forcibly removed from a courtroom by BFFs who had no idea she was a federal prosecutor. When the truth came to light, not only the judge but the entire courtroom was left in shock. This is not just a story about a courtroom, it is a profound lesson about prejudice, injustice, and the power of courage. Follow this dramatic story and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel today to help spread this meaningful message and not miss out on other inspiring stories. Harris County Courthouse, a busy and tense Monday morning, the sound of shoes clicking against tiled floors, papers rustling through files, and murmured conversations of worry blended into the heavy atmosphere. Courtroom number 3 was renowned for swift decisions, presided over by Judge William Davis, a middle-aged man with streaks of silver in his hair and piercing eyes who ruled with an unyielding demeanor. Judge Davis was infamous for his dislike of delays and had no patience for anyone he deemed a waste of his precious time. Those who entered this courtroom knew full well that unless they were fully prepared and knew how to stay silent, they had no chance. Into this setting walked Rachel Carter, a black woman in her early 30s. Rachel immediately caught the room's attention with her calm yet commanding presence. Her sharp black blazer and gleaming high heels not only exuded professionalism but also seemed to silently declare that she was ready to take on any challenge. Rachel was unlike the others present in the courtroom, people hunched over in fear or nervously glancing at the clock. She calmly took her seat in the speaker's row, opened her file, and meticulously reviewed her carefully prepared notes. Her goal today was to challenge a penalty she believed had been applied unfairly and unjustly. No one in the courtroom, not even Judge Davis, knew that this woman was no ordinary individual contesting a personal grievance. Rachel was a federal prosecutor accustomed to far greater pressures than the hearing before her today. But she wasn't there for her title, she was there to uphold what she believed in, that justice could not be manipulated by prejudice or unchecked power. The tension in the courtroom grew heavier as Judge Davis entered, his black robe flowing lightly with his firm strides. He took his seat, his sharp gaze scanning the room with a hint of annoyance. A few people lowered their heads, avoiding his eyes, but not Rachel. She maintained her steady, confident gaze. In a society where injustice and prejudice still permeate many corners, Rachel understood that she was not only advocating for her case but also representing those who had been undervalued or silenced by bias. Today, she was standing up not just to protect what was right but to send a powerful message: justice does not belong to the powerful but to everyone. The hearing began. Rachel rose to speak, her strong voice breaking the silence of the room. And thus, the story officially began. Here is the continuation of the text from your file, provided as requested. Rachel began presenting her argument, her voice steady and confident as it filled the courtroom. But just as she started, a sudden memory washed over her, slowing time in her mind. She recalled a day several years ago when she was a newly minted lawyer. Her best friend, Jonathan, a dedicated and gentle high school teacher, was arrested on accusations of a robbery he had not committed. All it took was a false statement from a witness and a negligent legal system that failed to give him a chance to defend himself. Rachel remembered that day vividly. Jonathan stood in the courtroom, his face stricken with confusion as the judge delivered the verdict. No one cared about his pleas, nor about the alibi his family had tried so hard to present. Rachel, then just a friend seated in the gallery, felt utterly powerless. She couldn't do anything to help him, and that helplessness became a haunting memory that followed her for years. After that incident, Jonathan lost his job and his faith in the system he had once taught his students to believe in. Justice always prevails, he used to say. Rachel vowed to herself that she would never let something like that happen to anyone else if there was anything she could do to stop it. That promise drove her to pursue law school, overcome prejudice, and become a federal prosecutor, a role in which she could stand up for justice, even if it meant confronting forces far greater than herself. Returning to the present, Rachel felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom fixed on her. She glanced down at the file in her hands, its pages filled with notes and evidence she had spent weeks preparing. She recalled the previous night, hours spent at her small apartment desk, the soft yellow light of a desk lamp illuminating the thick stack of files. On the desk sat a cold cup of coffee and a small photo frame of her parents, people who had taught her the value of integrity and perseverance. As she had pored over every statute, every detail of the case, she thought not just of herself but of people like Jonathan, those who lacked the resources or voice to defend themselves. She thought of those crushed by a system not because they were guilty, but because they had no opportunity to prove otherwise. Rachel closed her eyes briefly and took a deep breath. She knew this hearing would not be easy. Judge Davis was not someone easily persuaded, and his biases would likely be a significant obstacle. But she also knew that if she didn't fight, she would be no different from those who had turned their backs on Jonathan when he needed them most. Opening her eyes, her gaze hardened with determination. She told herself, today, I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for Jonathan, for the unheard, and all those forgotten by this system, Taking a deep breath, she gripped the file firmly. Her voice rang out again, this time stronger, pulling everyone back to the present moment. Your Honor, I not only have evidence proving that this penalty was applied incorrectly but also wish to assert that every person in this room, regardless of status or circumstance, deserves to be heard and treated fairly. From a corner of the room, a few people exchanged glances, as if realizing this was no ordinary case. But Judge Davis merely squinted, unimpressed. He tapped his pen on the bench and interrupted Rachel coldly. Miss Carter, please get to the point. We do not have time for personal speeches. Rachel pressed her lips together, suppressing her frustration. Inside, the memory of Jonathan and the drive for justice pushed her forward. She knew this was more than a personal battle, it was her chance to prove that justice could not be judged by appearances or prejudice. The hearing continued, but it was clear that tensions were rising. Rachel could feel every eye in the room watching, waiting to see what she would do next. And with all the resolve she could muster, she knew she would not back down. Here is the next portion of the text, as requested. Rachel continued her presentation, each word clear, sharp, and deeply persuasive. Her arguments were meticulously prepared, based on specific legal provisions and concrete evidence in the case file. Her voice was not loud, but the confidence and certainty in her tone commanded the attention of everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, Rachel emphasized, this penalty was not only misapplied but also violates the principles of fairness that our legal system is built upon. According to Section 15, Clause B of the statute, imposing a penalty that exceeds the prescribed limits is invalid. Judge Davis, who had been flipping through his papers, raised his head with an irritated expression. He raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. Miss Carter, he said coldly, we are not here for a lecture on the law. If you have specific evidence, get to the point. Don't waste my time or that of the court. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted uneasily. A few spectators exchanged nervous glances, whispering among themselves. Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had anticipated this. Judge Davis's impatience and biases were no surprise. Your Honor, Rachel resumed, her tone calm but with an added edge of determination, I have submitted all relevant evidence regarding this case. What I am presenting now is the context to help the court understand why this penalty needs to be reconsidered. Judge Davis narrowed his eyes, unimpressed by her resolve. He leaned forward slightly, tapping his pen against the desk in a grating rhythm. In one corner of the room, Michael Thompson, a seasoned attorney seated across from Rachel, smirked slightly. He had witnessed many proceedings in this courtroom and was well acquainted with Judge Davis's temperament. As Rachel opened another file, Michael leaned closer and murmured just loud enough for her to hear, Miss Carter, if I were you, I'd know my place. This is not the venue for grandstanding. Rachel did not turn to look at him, but his words felt like a small dagger piercing her patience. Instead of responding, she pressed her lips together and continued her presentation with unwavering composure. This penalty not only exceeds the allowable limits but has also been applied inconsistently compared to similar cases. I've included comparative documentation in the appendix for the court's reference. As Rachel spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. Those who initially focused solely on their matters or waited quietly for their turn now turned their attention to her. There were glances of curiosity, doubt, and even quiet judgment. Who does she think she is, speaking to Judge Davis like that? Someone in the back row whispered to their neighbor. I don't know, but she's not someone who backs down easily, the other replied, their gaze fixed on Rachel. A few others watched Rachel with silent admiration. It wasn't every day that someone stood up to Judge Davis and continued to present their case after being interrupted. Judge Davis crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair, his eyes locked on Rachel. With every sentence she spoke, his irritation seemed to grow. Finally, he raised his hand again, cutting her off for the second time. "Miss Carter," he said firmly, "I've told you already, this is not the place for lengthy arguments. If you don't respect the court's time, I will have to terminate your presentation." Rachel paused, her steely gaze fixed on the judge. She could feel the weight of the tension in the room, but she refused to back down. Her voice steady, she replied, "Your Honor, I have the utmost respect for the court's time. However, I also believe that defending one's rights and adhering to the law cannot be curtailed by impatience." Judge Davis raised an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback by Rachel's calm response. The room seemed to freeze, every eye locked on the silent exchange between the two. Rachel's words, though not loud, resonated more powerfully than any other sound in the room at that moment. Here is the continuation of the text as requested. In the gallery, whispers grew louder. Some spectators began to murmur among themselves, no longer just out of curiosity. Some voices expressed support for Rachel, while others remained skeptical. "She's got guts," a man murmured to his companion. "Who stands up to Judge Davis like that?" "It's just a penalty, isn't it?" another said dismissively. "Why is she making such a big deal?" "But she's right," a woman seated near the front interjected quietly. "I don't think she's doing this just for herself. Look at the way she's speaking. This isn't just about a penalty." More and more attention in the courtroom gravitated toward Rachel. People began to realize that despite Judge Davis's attempts to stifle her argument, Rachel was not someone who could be easily subdued. She wasn't merely presenting a case, she was standing up for principles she believed in. Michael Thompson, watching the escalating tension between Rachel and Judge Davis, smirked and shook his head. "Miss Carter, I'd be careful if I were you," he said softly. "Don't let your convictions cost you too much this time." Rachel turned to look directly at him, her gaze unflinching. She didn't respond with words, but her eyes said it all, "I am not here for your approval." Rachel knew the situation was growing increasingly challenging. Judge Davis's patience was running thin, and Michael Thompson seemed intent on adding fuel to the fire. But she also knew that the greater the pressure, the more crucial it was to hold her ground. This wasn't just a case, it was a battle for justice, and she would not back down. Judge Davis leaned forward, slamming his pen on the desk with a sharp, resounding crack, interrupting Rachel for the third time. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice rising with anger. "I've made myself clear. If you cannot respect the order of this courtroom and stop these irrelevant arguments immediately, I will have no choice but to ask you to leave." Rachel did not flinch at the threat. She took a deep breath, her voice remaining calm but with an unmistakable edge of determination. "Your Honor, I believe what I'm presenting is entirely relevant to this case. I'm not just defending my rights but also highlighting that this penalty violates fundamental principles of the law. If the court won't consider this, then who will?" The gallery began to stir. A few spectators exchanged glances, clearly drawn in by Rachel's steadfastness. Yet the tension between her and Judge Davis had reached its peak. Davis gripped his pen tightly, his face reddening with frustration. He slammed his hand down on the desk again, the sound reverberating through the courtroom. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing across the room. "Miss Carter, if you cannot comply with the court's instructions, I will have no choice but to have you removed." Rachel stood silent for a moment, her eyes locking onto Judge Davis without a trace of fear. She had anticipated this, but she also knew she couldn't abandon her arguments simply because of impatience and bias. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her tone calm, "I respect your authority, but I cannot remain silent when I see injustice unfolding before me." Those were her final words. Judge Davis waved his hand sharply, giving the order. "Jason, Mark, escort her out. Right now." Two court officers, Jason and Mark, approached Rachel. They grabbed her arms, avoiding her gaze as if uncomfortable with the situation. Rachel did not resist. She stood firm, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering with dignity and resolve. The courtroom fell into stunned silence for several seconds, as if no one could quite believe what had just happened. But as Jason and Mark began to lead Rachel toward the door, whispers erupted. "She didn't deserve to be treated like that," a woman in the gallery murmured to her companion. "It's unbelievable," a man muttered. "All she was doing was standing up for what's right." Rachel walked with measured steps, the clicking of her high heels echoing against the wooden floor. Each step was deliberate and unyielding. Though escorted out, she held her head high, refusing to let the humiliation overshadow her dignity. Jason and Mark led Rachel to the door. A few spectators watched her go with sympathetic eyes, while others remained silent, unwilling to speak up. Here is the continuation of the text as requested. Do you think Rachel was right to stand firm despite being interrupted and removed by Judge Davis? How would you balance respecting authority with the courage to stand up for your beliefs? Share your thoughts in the comments. As Rachel disappeared through the door, the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. A man seated in the back, who had remained silent until then, turned to the woman beside him. She had the guts to stand up to Judge Davis. "I've never seen anyone do that." "But look what it got her," the woman whispered back. "Dragged out like a criminal, even though she was doing the right thing." Meanwhile, Judge Davis ignored the murmurs around him. He lowered his eyes to the files in front of him and signaled the clerk to call the next case. "Next case," he barked, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Rachel paused briefly outside the courtroom door. She turned her head, letting her gaze sweep over the spectators. Though she said nothing, her look carried a powerful message. This isn't over. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy thump. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere grew strangely quiet. Everyone felt the weight of the injustice that had just occurred, but no one dared speak of it aloud. Judge Davis sat rigidly on the bench, his face stoic, but his fingers tapped lightly on the desk, betraying his unease. He knew he had lost control, and the situation would not resolve itself as neatly as he had hoped. Outside, Rachel stood still in the empty hallway. She took a deep breath, regaining her composure. Light from a nearby window illuminated her face, highlighting her determination. She didn't feel defeated because this wasn't the end for her. This was only the beginning of a much larger fight. What had just unfolded in the courtroom didn't deter her, it only strengthened her conviction that justice must be defended, no matter the obstacles. Straightening her coat, she cast one last glance at the courtroom door before walking away. In her mind, plans for her next steps were already taking shape. This fight is far from over. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Rachel, echoing coldly in the long, empty hallway. She stood there, her shoulders straight, her gaze fixed ahead, though her tightly clenched fists at her sides betrayed the emotions roiling within. The sting of humiliation from being forcibly removed in front of so many eyes still burned, but Rachel refused to let herself falter. She walked slowly toward a nearby bench, where soft light from a window cast a gentle glow. Sitting down, she stared out the window, her mind drifting back to painful memories from her career. Rachel recalled her early days in law, as a young black woman in a field rife with prejudice and discrimination. She had often been underestimated. She remembered an interview at a prestigious law firm. When she walked into the room, the manager's gaze scanned her from head to toe with a scrutinizing air. He didn't ask much about her qualifications but instead focused on whether she would fit the company culture, a polite way of saying she didn't belong there. She also remembered her first days as a prosecutor, when her colleagues dismissed her as nothing more than a diversity hire. Once, she overheard a group of male colleagues whispering behind her back, she wouldn't be here if it weren't for her looks or that diversity card. Their words cut into her self-esteem like a knife, but instead of reacting, Rachel quietly let her success speak for itself. Rachel glanced down at her hand, the same hands that had signed countless documents and prepared numerous case files in her fight for justice. This time was no different. She knew that what had just happened in the courtroom wasn't the end, it was merely a temporary setback. And she wouldn't let it hold her back. She reminded herself, I've overcome so many obstacles to get here. I won't let anyone or anything make me give up now, Here is the continuation of the text. At that moment, a soft sound echoed down the hallway. Rachel looked up to see a young woman approaching her. Emily, a junior court clerk, walked briskly toward Rachel. She seemed hesitant, as though unsure whether she should approach, but eventually, she stopped in front of Rachel. "Miss Carter," Emily said in a small but sincere voice. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened earlier." Rachel looked up at Emily, her sharp eyes softening with warmth. "Thank you, Emily," Rachel replied. "But you don't need to apologize. None of this was your fault." Emily lowered her head, wringing her hands nervously in front of her, her expression filled with regret. "But I just feel like it was so unfair, the way the judge treated you, cutting you off and then having you dragged out. I think he was wrong, but I didn't dare say anything. I was afraid I'd lose my job if I spoke up." Rachel smiled faintly, not because she found Emily's words amusing but because she understood that fear all too well. She had faced moments like that, times when she wanted to stand up but felt the consequences were too great to bear. "Emily," Rachel said, her voice soft but filled with resolve, "I know how you feel. I've been afraid too. But if we don't speak up, then who will? Change takes time, but it starts with small actions. Don't let fear hold you back. Justice needs people willing to fight for it, even when it's hard." Emily raised her head, her eyes glimmering with a spark of hope. "Do you think someone as small as me can make a difference?" Rachel met Emily's gaze directly and answered firmly, "Absolutely. Every single person has the power to make a difference, even if it's just through a word, an action, or a single right decision. Believe in that." Emily stood there as though weighing Rachel's words carefully. Finally, she gave a small smile, the hesitation in her eyes fading. "Thank you, Miss Carter. I think I needed to hear that." Rachel nodded, returning the smile. "You're not alone, Emily. Never forget that." Emily turned and walked away with newfound confidence in her step. Rachel watched her go, feeling that this brief conversation might not immediately change the system, but it could plant a seed of hope in Emily's mind. And sometimes, that was all it took to begin change. As the hallway fell silent again, Rachel stood up, straightened her coat, and walked toward the large window at the end of the corridor. Sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a soft golden glow over her face. In her heart, her determination only grew stronger. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with each step, she was no longer just representing herself. She was standing for everyone like Emily, people who needed to see that justice was worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle was. Rachel took a deep breath, turned, and walked out of the hallway. She knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of a much larger fight. Here is the continuation of the text. As Rachel left the courthouse, the door closed behind her, but the tension she left behind remained palpable. Inside, the atmosphere was no longer the same. The spectators seated in the gallery began to murmur, their whispers spreading like ripples. Sarah Johnson, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, leaned toward the man sitting next to her. "She didn't look like someone being dragged out unwillingly," Sarah whispered with a hint of admiration. "She walked out of here with her head held high, as if she was the one in control." The man next to her shrugged, his eyes betraying a hint of concern. "Brave, sure, but she's going up against Judge Davis. Everyone knows he doesn't take kindly to anyone challenging his authority. I don't think this will end well for her." Sarah narrowed her eyes, her expression sharpening. Maybe, but she wasn't just speaking for herself. The way she presented her case, the way she held her ground, that's someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Similar conversations rippled throughout the room. Some exchanged approving glances, while others remained skeptical. But it was clear that, whether they admitted it or not, Rachel had left a strong impression. At the front, Judge Davis sat stiffly, trying to appear as though nothing had happened. He tapped his pen lightly on the desk, his eyes darting toward the court clerk as if to urge them forward. "Next case," he ordered, his voice tinged with authority. A man stepped forward to present his case, but the courtroom's atmosphere still hung heavy with the tension of what had just occurred. Judge Davis tried to focus on the file before him, but his hand, holding the pen, trembled slightly. He knew that ejecting Rachel hadn't eased the situation, instead, it had drawn the scrutiny of everyone in the room, casting doubt on his authority. Alex Carter, a young court clerk seated in a corner to Judge Davis's right, studied the case files in his hands.
Outwardly calm, Alex's thoughts were racing as he replayed the earlier scene. The name Rachel Carter felt oddly familiar to him. Very familiar. He began flipping through the documents submitted before the trial, his brows furrowing deeper with each line he read. "She's not like a regular defendant," Alex murmured to himself. As Alex skimmed Rachel's resume, his eyes caught on a key detail: federal prosecutor. His heart skipped a beat. He looked up, his gaze shifting toward Judge Davis, who continued to project an air of indifference to what had transpired. "No way," Alex muttered, flipping through a few more pages. With each line he read, the truth became clearer. Rachel Carter wasn't just any woman challenging a penalty, she was a federal prosecutor, one of the rare few who ever entered a courtroom in a personal capacity. A rush of adrenaline coursed through Alex as he realized Judge Davis had made a grave mistake. Alex glanced at Judge Davis. He could see the stiffness in the judge's posture, but beneath the surface, there was a flicker of unease. "Your Honor," Alex finally spoke, his voice hesitant but firm. Judge Davis didn't look up. "What is it, Alex?" "I'm busy." Alex stood, holding Rachel's file in his hand. He approached Judge Davis's bench, lowering his voice to avoid drawing attention. "Your Honor, I think there's something you need to see." Judge Davis raised his head, narrowing his eyes in irritation. "What is it?" "I don't have time for irrelevant details." Alex took a steadying breath. "Your Honor, regarding Ms. Rachel Carter, she's not just an ordinary citizen. She's a federal prosecutor." The words hit Judge Davis like a thunderclap. His eyes widened as he stared at Alex. "What? Are you sure?" Alex nodded, placing Rachel's file on the desk before him. "All the information is right here, Your Honor. I don't think we handled this case the way we should have." Judge Davis grabbed the file, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through its pages. Each line felt like a harsh reminder of the serious misstep he had made. A federal prosecutor, and he had her forcibly removed in front of everyone in the gallery. A few spectators noticed the change in Judge Davis's expression. The whispers grew louder, but this time they weren't about Rachel, they were about the judge himself. Here is the continuation of the text. Judge Davis worked to mask the unease in his gaze. He placed the file down, gripping his pen tightly to steady himself. He knew that ejecting Rachel from the courtroom had not only undermined her credibility but could also become a significant issue for his reputation. "All right," he said softly to Alex, his voice losing some of its commanding tone. "Proceed with the next case and keep everything under control. I'll reconsider this matter." Alex nodded, returning to his seat, yet he knew deep down that this wasn't something that could be resolved so easily. The events that had unfolded had left a noticeable crack in the air of authority Judge Davis had worked so hard to maintain. While Judge Davis feigned composure, everyone in the courtroom sensed that something was amiss. The murmurs continued, and the spectators' gazes no longer held unwavering confidence in the judge before them. Outside the courtroom, Rachel was no longer there, but her presence lingered inside. Judge Davis realized that his actions might have set the stage for a larger confrontation, one he might not be able to control. Alex returned to his desk, but his mind was far from settled. The file on Rachel Carter still lay in front of him, each line a stark reminder that what had just happened was far from ordinary. He knew what he had to do. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Alex stood, picked up the file, and walked toward Judge Davis's bench. "Your Honor," Alex said, this time his voice clear and firm. "I need to speak with you privately. This is important." Judge Davis looked up, his expression showing irritation. "What now, Alex? Can't you see I'm busy?" Alex placed the file on the bench in front of Judge Davis, pointing to the bold text on the first page, "Rachel Carter, federal prosecutor." He spoke deliberately, emphasizing each word. "Your Honor, I think you need to review this file carefully. Ms. Carter is not just another person here to contest a penalty, she is a federal prosecutor." Judge Davis froze, the pen in his hand halting midair. He stared at Alex, his expression turning to disbelief. "What are you saying? A federal prosecutor? Are you sure?" Alex nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor." This is her file. I verified it, all the information is here.
Judge Davis took the file, his eyes scanning the lines rapidly. Each page seemed to weigh on him as he realized the gravity of his actions. Rachel Carter's name was boldly printed on the first page, followed by her title, Assistant United States Attorney. Beads of sweat formed on Judge Davis's forehead as he flipped through the pages, reviewing and rechecking the information as if unwilling to believe it.
How did I not know this before the hearing began? He muttered under his breath, his voice low but tense. Alex, standing by the bench, remained silent, observing the changes in the judge's demeanor. Judge Davis took a deep breath, attempting to reclaim his usual air of authority, though his confidence had visibly wavered. He placed the file down on his desk and looked up at Alex. "Call Ms. Carter back," he ordered, his voice losing its usual commanding tone and carrying a note of awkwardness. "Immediately. I want to hear the rest of what she has to say." Alex nodded and quickly left the courtroom.
The spectators in the gallery began to murmur as they saw Alex exit the room with urgency. A few turned to each other, speculating about what was happening.
"What's going on?
Why did the clerk leave so suddenly?" a woman whispered.
"Is Ms. Carter coming back?" another man asked, his voice tinged with curiosity.
The whispers quickly spread throughout the courtroom.
The audience's curiosity peaked as they noticed a clear shift in Judge Davis's demeanor. He no longer sat with his usual upright posture that symbolized absolute authority.
Instead, he sifted through the papers on his desk, his hands trembling slightly. Judge Davis glanced toward the door, trying to mask his unease, but with each passing moment, the silence in the courtroom grew heavier. The spectators, many of whom had come for routine legal proceedings, now sensed that something out of the ordinary was unfolding. When the courtroom door opened again, all eyes turned toward it.
Alex re-entered, followed by Rachel.
Rachel walked in with her composure intact, her demeanor calm, her shoulders straight, her gaze steady. She looked directly at the judge's bench, showing no signs of hesitation even as every eye in the room fixated on her. Judge Davis straightened in his chair, attempting to reassert his authority, but his eyes avoided meeting Rachel's directly. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice attempting to sound measured.
"I've reviewed your file.
I believe perhaps we got off on the wrong foot earlier.
I'd like to invite you to continue presenting your argument."
Rachel stood before him, her sharp gaze free of arrogance. She nodded, her voice calm but purposeful.
"Thank you, Your Honor. I am ready to proceed. Here is the continuation of the text."
The courtroom was so quiet that the soft tapping of a pen from a lawyer in the corner could be heard. Everyone sat up, waiting intently for what would happen next.
Rachel knew this was not just an opportunity to present the truth, it was a moment to affirm the importance of perseverance and justice.
She took a deep breath, preparing to continue her argument while the entire courtroom watched in silence.
"Your Honor,"
Rachel began, her voice steady but firm, "I appreciate the opportunity to resume my presentation. As I was saying earlier, the penalty in question not only exceeds the allowable limits but was applied in a manner that violates the principles of fairness and consistency required by law. I have provided comparative case studies and legal precedents in the appendix for the court's reference." Rachel's voice carried with conviction, her words resonating through the room. Judge Davis, for once, remained silent, his gaze fixed on her with what appeared to be a mixture of focus and discomfort. He tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, perhaps as a way to mask his unease.
Rachel continued, "The legal system is not meant to intimidate or silence those seeking justice.
Instead, it is meant to provide every individual, regardless of their background or status, with a fair chance to be heard and judged based on the facts and the law.
Unfortunately, this case reflects a deviation from that principle."
From the gallery, the spectators listened intently, their earlier skepticism giving way to genuine interest.
Some exchanged glances, their expressions showing admiration for Rachel's composure and clarity.
Even those who had doubted her initially seemed to realize that she wasn't just advocating for herself, she was fighting for a principle larger than the case at hand. Judge Davis leaned back slightly, his expression tense but unreadable. When Rachel paused, he nodded slowly. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone quieter than usual, "I will admit that your argument raises valid points. However, you must also understand the importance of maintaining decorum and efficiency in this courtroom.
Rachel met his gaze directly, unflinching. Your Honor, I fully understand the importance of decorum.
But I also believe that justice cannot be sacrificed for the sake of expediency. Every person who steps into this courtroom deserves to be treated with respect and fairness, regardless of who they are or the circumstances they face. The room fell into a heavy silence, her words hanging in the air. Judge Davis glanced at the file on his desk, his lips pressing into a thin line. It was clear that he was grappling with the weight of her argument. From the back of the room, Sarah Johnson whispered to the man beside her, "She's right.
Justice shouldn't depend on how much patience the judge has or how important someone looks. It should be the same for everyone."
The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. She's not just fighting for herself. She's making a point that affects all of us. Rachel, sensing the shift in the room, took a step forward and addressed the judge with unwavering determination. Your Honor, this is not about challenging the authority of this court.
It's about ensuring that the authority of the law is upheld and applied equitably.
As a federal prosecutor, I have seen firsthand the impact of decisions made in courtrooms like this one. These decisions set precedents not just for legal outcomes but for public trust in the justice system. I urge this court to consider the broader implications of this case.
Judge Davis exhaled deeply, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk.
He finally nodded, his voice subdued. Ms. Carter, I will take your argument under advisement. I assure you that this court will carefully review the evidence and reach a fair conclusion. Rachel inclined her head in acknowledgement.
Thank you, Your Honor.
As Rachel returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent, the tension slowly giving way to a sense of reflection. Judge Davis turned his attention back to the file in front of him, but his usual stern demeanor seemed softened.
The spectators, too, appeared to be grappling with the gravity of what they had witnessed. Here is the continuation of the text.
The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted significantly. What had begun as a tense and confrontational scene was now imbued with a sense of introspection. Even those who had initially dismissed Rachel's resolve now viewed her with a newfound respect. Judge Davis remained focused on the file before him, but his movements were slower, his usual commanding demeanor replaced with something more reserved. For a man known for his rigidity and unyielding authority, this was an unusual sight. From her seat, Rachel maintained her composure, her expression calm yet resolute. She was fully aware of the eyes on her, both supportive and critical. This moment wasn't just about her argument, it was about standing firm in the face of prejudice and proving that justice, while sometimes flawed, was worth fighting for. In the gallery, Sarah Johnson leaned closer to her companion, whispering, she made her point without losing her cool. That takes guts. The man beside her nodded. I've been coming to this courtroom for years, and I've never seen anyone challenge Judge Davis like that and hold their ground. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, whispers about the incident began to spread. Those who had witnessed Rachel's removal shared their impressions with others in the courthouse. Some viewed her defiance as reckless, while others saw it as inspiring. Emily, the young court clerk who had spoken to Rachel earlier, found herself reflecting on their conversation. She glanced toward the courtroom door, her mind replaying Rachel's words, "Change doesn't come from silence. Justice needs people willing to fight for it, even when it's hard." Inside, Judge Davis finally looked up from Rachel's file, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his glasses and tapped his pen lightly against the desk. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone more measured than before, "your argument has given this court much to consider. While I may not agree with all of your points, I recognize the effort and conviction behind your case. I will take the necessary time to review your evidence and ensure that a just decision is made." Rachel rose from her seat and gave a slight nod, her voice steady.
"Thank you, Your Honor. That's all I ask."
The courtroom fell silent again, the weight of the moment lingering in the air. Judge Davis turned his attention to the clerk and signaled for the next case to proceed. Yet, despite his attempt to move forward, it was clear that the events of the day had left a lasting impression on everyone present.
As the next case began, Rachel quietly gathered her belongings.
She moved with the same calm dignity she had displayed throughout the hearing, her head held high. When she turned to leave, she caught sight of Emily standing near the doorway, watching her with a mixture of admiration and determination.
Rachel offered Emily a faint smile before exiting the courtroom.
The sound of the door closing behind her marked the end of this chapter, but Rachel knew her fight was far from over. She had planted a seed, not just in Judge Davis's courtroom, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the day's events. Here is the continuation of the text. As Rachel walked down the courthouse hallway, the echoes of her heels resounded against the polished floor. The corridor was quiet, but her thoughts were anything but. The weight of what had transpired in the courtroom settled over her, not as a burden, but as a call to action. Each step she took felt deliberate, a reminder that her journey for justice was only beginning. She paused near a bench by a window, where the sunlight poured in, warming the cool marble beneath her. Rachel looked outside, her gaze fixed on the cityscape beyond. She thought of all the people she had represented, those who had been silenced or ignored by a system that often failed them. She thought of her best friend, Jonathan, and the promise she had made to herself so many years ago, to never let injustice go unchallenged. Rachel's moment of reflection was interrupted by the soft shuffle of footsteps. She turned to see Emily, the young court clerk, approaching hesitantly. Emily stopped a few steps away, clutching a file to her chest, her expression a mixture of uncertainty and resolve.
"Miss Carter," Emily began, her voice tentative.
Rachel offered her a warm smile.
"Emily, it's good to see you again. Is everything all right?"
Emily nodded but hesitated, as if searching for the right words.
"Finally," she said, "I just wanted to thank you.
For what you said earlier, and for what you did in the courtroom. I've never seen anyone stand up like that, especially to Judge Davis." Rachel's smile softened, and she gestured for Emily to sit beside her on the bench.
"Emily, sometimes standing up means risking something. But if we don't, nothing ever changes.
People like Judge Davis are used to being unquestioned.
It's not easy, but it's necessary."
Emily sat down, her hands nervously fidgeting with the edge of the file she held.
"I want to be like that," she said quietly. "I want to stand up for what's right, but I'm scared. What if I lose my job? What if no one listens?" Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid, Emily. It means you act despite the fear. Change doesn't come overnight, and it doesn't come without risk.
But every small step matters. You have the power to make a difference, even if it's just by being kind, speaking up when you see something wrong, or supporting others who fight for justice." Emily looked up at Rachel, her eyes filled with a newfound determination.
"You really believe that, don't you?"
Rachel nodded firmly.
"I do. And I believe in you, too.
The system may be flawed, but it's made up of people.
People like you have the power to shape it for the better."
Emily smiled faintly, her earlier hesitation giving way to a sense of purpose.
"Thank you, Miss Carter. I'll try to be braver."
Rachel squeezed Emily's shoulder gently.
"That's all anyone can do, try. And remember, you're not alone. There are more of us than you think, people who believe in fairness and justice. We're stronger together."
As Emily stood to leave, her steps seemed lighter, her posture more confident. Rachel watched her go, a sense of quiet pride washing over her. She knew that Emily's journey was just beginning, much like her own. Turning back to the window, Rachel took one last deep breath. The path ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she was ready. She had faced adversity before, and she would continue to do so. For herself, for Jonathan, for Emily, and for all those who couldn't fight for themselves. Rachel rose from the bench, adjusted her coat, and walked toward the courthouse exit. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter now, illuminating her path forward. As she stepped outside, she felt a renewed sense of purpose.
Here is the continuation of the text.
As Rachel descended the courthouse steps, a few people lingering outside turned their heads.
Some recognized her, their whispers carrying a mix of admiration and curiosity.
Others simply watched her with respect, sensing the determination in her stride. Rachel kept her focus straight ahead, her thoughts resolute. She paused at the bottom of the steps, allowing herself a moment to take in her surroundings. The air was crisp, the bustle of the city unfolding around her. Cars honked in the distance, and pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, unaware of the battle she had just fought inside the courthouse. Yet, Rachel knew the significance of what had occurred was not lost on those who had witnessed it. From behind her, a voice called out hesitantly, "Miss Carter?" Rachel turned to see a young man approaching. He was dressed in a simple suit, his expression earnest and slightly nervous. "I just wanted to say," he began, "that what you did in there, it was inspiring. Most people wouldn't have dared to stand up like that, especially against someone like Judge Davis." Rachel gave him a kind smile. "Thank you. But it wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who deserves fairness and respect in the courtroom." The man nodded, visibly moved. "I'm a law student," he admitted. "I came here to observe today, and I learned more from you than I ever could from a textbook. You reminded me why I want to pursue this career, to fight for what's right." Rachel's smile widened. "Then you're on the right path. Remember, the law is only as strong as the people who uphold it. Use your voice wisely, and don't let fear or complacency hold you back." "I won't," the man replied with newfound confidence. "Thank you for showing me what it means to truly stand up for justice." As he walked away, Rachel felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't just about the immediate battle, she was planting seeds for a better future. Every conversation, every connection, added momentum to the larger fight for equality and fairness. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. Rachel pulled it out and saw a flood of notifications. Text messages from colleagues, emails from advocacy groups, and social media alerts all pointed to one thing: her courtroom confrontation had gone viral. A video clip captured by someone in the gallery showed her being escorted out of the courtroom, walking with dignity and defiance. It was accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForRachel and #StandUpForFairness, which were quickly gaining traction. Rachel scrolled through some of the posts. Comments ranged from outrage at Judge Davis's actions to admiration for her bravery. "This is what courage looks like," one tweet read. "Rachel Carter is a hero. We need more people like her in the justice system," another user wrote. Rachel put her phone away, knowing this was only the beginning of a larger movement. The story wasn't just about her, it was about exposing the flaws in the system and inspiring others to take a stand. She made a mental note to reach out to some of the organizations and individuals expressing support. Together, they could amplify the message and push for meaningful change. Here is the continuation of the text. Rachel decided to head home, her mind already formulating the next steps in her fight for justice. The viral attention was a double-edged sword. It brought visibility to the systemic issues she was challenging but also placed her under intense scrutiny. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with both support and resistance. As she walked through her neighborhood, a few people recognized her. Some offered words of encouragement, while others gave her curious glances. Rachel acknowledged them with polite nods, her focus unwavering. When she reached her apartment, she unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar comfort of her home. The small living space was simple yet inviting, adorned with framed photographs of her family and friends. A small desk in the corner was cluttered with legal files, highlighters, and sticky notes, a testament to the countless hours she spent preparing her cases. Rachel set her bag down and sank into the worn but comfortable chair by the window. She picked up her phone and began responding to messages. Her colleagues were divided in their reactions, some applauded her courage, while others warned her about potential professional repercussions. Rachel appreciated the support but refused to let the warnings deter her. She had faced challenges before and knew the importance of staying true to her principles. One message, however, stood out. It was from Jonathan, her best friend, whose wrongful conviction years ago had ignited her passion for justice. He had seen the viral video and sent her a heartfelt text. "Rachel, I just watched the clip. You've come so far, and I'm so proud of you. What you did today wasn't just brave, it was necessary. Thank you for standing up for people like me who didn't have the chance. You're making a difference." Asterisk. Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she read his words. Jonathan's support meant everything to her.
She typed a reply, her fingers trembling slightly. Thank you, Jonathan. You've always been my inspiration. This fight isn't just mine, it's for all of us. I promise to keep going, no matter what. Asterisk. As she hit send, Rachel felt a renewed sense of purpose. She turned her attention to her laptop and began drafting an email to a civil rights organization that had reached out earlier in the day. They had expressed interest in collaborating to address judicial bias and systemic inequities. Rachel knew this was an opportunity to expand the impact of her fight beyond the courtroom. The email read, "Thank you for reaching out. I would be honored to work with your organization to raise awareness and advocate for meaningful reforms. Together, we can push for a justice system that truly upholds fairness and equality for all. Please let me know how I can contribute to your efforts." Asterisk. As she hit send, a wave of determination washed over her. The events of the day were only the beginning. Rachel knew that real change required sustained effort, collaboration, and the courage to challenge deeply entrenched systems. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Rachel reflected on the impact of her actions. The courtroom had been just one battle, but the larger fight for justice was ongoing. She thought about the people who had reached out, the conversations she had sparked, and the voices she had amplified. It wasn't just her story anymore, it was a collective call to action. Rachel lay down, her mind still buzzing with ideas and plans. As she closed her eyes, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." Here is the continuation of the text. The next morning, Rachel woke up early. The sunlight streaming through the window was accompanied by the sounds of the city stirring to life. She stretched and reached for her phone, which had been buzzing with notifications throughout the night. News outlets had picked up her story, and it was gaining momentum. Headlines like "Prosecutor Dragged from Courtroom Sparks National Debate on Judicial Bias" and "Rachel Carter, a Voice for Justice" dominated her feed. Rachel scrolled through the articles, noting the mix of opinions. Some praised her courage and used her story as a catalyst for discussions about systemic issues in the judicial system. Others critiqued her for challenging authority, arguing that her approach was too confrontational. She read each perspective carefully, using both the support and criticism to inform her next steps. Her phone buzzed again, a call this time. It was from one of the civil rights organizations she had contacted the previous night. Ms. Carter, the voice on the other end said, "Thank you for getting back to us so quickly. We've been following your story, and we believe it highlights some of the key issues we've been working to address. We'd love to collaborate with you on an initiative to educate the public about judicial accountability." Rachel smiled, already thinking of how her experiences could contribute to such an effort. "I'm honored," she replied. "I believe this is an important conversation, and I'd be happy to help in any way I can." The call lasted over an hour as they discussed plans for community workshops, media appearances, and the possibility of creating a legal aid program for marginalized groups. By the time the call ended, Rachel felt a surge of excitement. This wasn't just about her case anymore, it was about building something that could create lasting change. Later that afternoon, Rachel stepped out into the crisp air, heading to a coffee shop where she had agreed to meet with a journalist who had requested an interview. As she entered the bustling cafe, she spotted the journalist, a young woman with a notebook and recorder, waiting for her at a corner table. "Ms. Carter," the journalist greeted her warmly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Your story has captured the nation's attention, and I think it's important for people to hear your perspective directly." Rachel ordered a coffee and took a seat, her posture poised yet approachable. "Thank you for giving me the platform to share my story. I hope it inspires others to speak out and demand accountability." The journalist leaned forward, pen poised over her notebook. "What was going through your mind in the courtroom when Judge Davis interrupted you repeatedly and ultimately had you removed?" Rachel paused, choosing her words carefully. "In that moment, I wasn't just thinking about myself. I was thinking about all the people who've been silenced or ignored because they didn't fit a certain mold or didn't have the resources to fight back. I knew that standing firm was necessary, not just for my case, but to challenge a system that often prioritizes power over fairness." "And what do you hope comes from this?" the journalist asked, her expression earnest.
I hope this sparks a conversation about the role of bias in our legal system, Rachel said. But more importantly, I hope it leads to actionable change. We need more transparency, more accountability, and a greater focus on ensuring that every person is treated with respect and fairness in the courtroom. The interview continued, with Rachel sharing insights from her career and her plans to work with advocacy groups. By the time it concluded, the journalist looked inspired.
Thank you, Ms. Carter.
Your words are powerful, and I believe they'll resonate with many people. As Rachel left the cafe, she felt a sense of fulfillment. Her voice was reaching more people, and the momentum for change was growing. She knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but she was ready for it.
Here is the continuation of the text.
Over the next few days, Rachel's story continued to dominate headlines and social media discussions. The viral clip of her being escorted out of the courtroom had sparked outrage, but it was her composed return and powerful speech that resonated most with the public. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences with systemic bias, amplifying the call for accountability in the judicial system.
Rachel's inbox was flooded with messages, some from strangers expressing their support, others from activists, lawyers, and advocacy groups wanting to collaborate.
She carefully reviewed each one, prioritizing opportunities that aligned with her mission to create meaningful change.
One email in particular caught her attention.
It was from a law professor at a prestigious university, inviting her to speak to their students about the intersection of law, ethics, and justice.
Rachel replied immediately. Thank you for your invitation. I would be honored to speak with your students.
It's crucial for future legal professionals to understand the importance of challenging biases within the system and advocating for fairness. Please let me know the date and time, and I will make the necessary arrangements.
Asterisk.
As the days passed, Rachel's schedule became increasingly packed with meetings, interviews, and planning sessions. She collaborated with civil rights organizations to draft proposals for judicial reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges and increased transparency in courtroom proceedings. Each initiative felt like a step closer to the equitable system she envisioned. Despite her busy schedule, Rachel made time for personal connections. She called Jonathan to update him on her progress. His voice was filled with pride and gratitude as he encouraged her to keep pushing forward. "You're doing something incredible, Rachel," Jonathan said. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice.
Keep going. The world needs more people like you."
Rachel's heart swelled with emotion. Jonathan's words reminded her of why she had chosen this path and strengthened her resolve to continue. One evening, as Rachel reviewed a draft proposal for a public awareness campaign, her phone buzzed with a notification. A major news network had aired a segment on her story, featuring interviews with courtroom spectators, legal experts, and community leaders. The segment highlighted the broader implications of her confrontation with Judge Davis, framing it as a pivotal moment in the fight for judicial accountability. Rachel watched the segment, her emotions a mix of pride and determination. The public was rallying behind her, and the movement she had unintentionally sparked was gaining traction. But she also knew this was just the beginning.
Real change required more than headlines and hashtags.
It demanded persistence, collaboration, and structural reform. The next morning, Rachel attended a community meeting organized by one of the advocacy groups she had partnered with. The room was filled with people of diverse backgrounds, all united by a shared commitment to justice. Rachel spoke passionately about her experiences and the need for collective action. "We have a responsibility," she told the audience, "not just to identify the flaws in our system but to work together to fix them. Change doesn't happen in isolation, it happens when we come together, support one another, and refuse to accept the status quo." The room erupted into applause, the energy palpable. As Rachel looked around at the faces of those who shared her vision, she felt a renewed sense of hope. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a movement, and it was growing stronger every day. Rachel's message continued to resonate far and wide.
Legal professionals, activists, and even politicians began to take notice. Discussions around judicial bias and systemic reform gained prominence in the media, with Rachel often cited as a symbol of resilience and accountability.
She became a sought-after speaker, traveling to universities, conferences, and town halls to share her story and inspire others to take action. One particularly impactful event was a panel discussion at a prominent legal symposium. The panel included renowned judges, lawyers, and advocates, all gathered to address the question, how can we ensure equity and fairness in our justice system? Rachel was the youngest and least experienced panelist, but her voice carried the most weight.